back to our Voices of Those special program on Yang Rui, aiming to complete national defense modernization by 2035 and transform the PLA into a world-class military. China's military build-up is hastening on a planet full of uncertainties, with the US and Russia revising their nuclear policy. The threat of nuclear competition has intensified. Yet China adheres to a known first use of nuclear weapons under any circumstances, while actively shouldering international responsibility by contributing the largest blue helmets among the UN Security Council permanent members. What does China's growing military build-up mean for the planet? What's China's view on the US-Russia nuclear competition, and how will China assume its international responsibility in peacekeeping, anti-piracy, anti-terrorism, and disaster relief? To discuss more about China's military build-up in the international arena and more, I'm very pleased to have Senior Colonel Zhou Bo from the Office for International Military Cooperation at the Ministry of National Defense and Professor Xu Hui come on down from International College of Defense Studies at National Defense University, PLA, in the studio. We shall also speak to PAVEL FELGENHAUER, a defense analyst in Russia, via satellite. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Professor Xu, how does China view or how does China assess the threat, and what do you think of China's national security outlook?
I think generally speaking, we still insist on seeing that peace and development are the main theme of the international security. And in regards of the regional security, I think in recent years we are getting better now, and generally speaking we can say opportunities and challenge coexisted, but more opportunities for maintaining peace and managing disputes. Although most of the historical disputes has not been totally resolved, have no solution yet, but we can see that in the past 1 or 2 years, all the hotspots getting lowered down, and the more communications has been carried out between China and the neighboring countries, and more understanding and accumulated or more trust, and in addition to that, more mutual interest, and we see the cake of the common interest is getting bigger. So all parties concerned have a stronger incentives to sit down to talk and to find a peaceful solution or try to properly manage it. I think that is a good development. But at the same time, we also have to pay attention to the potential challenges. For instance, already some of the issues, there are different voices and some outside players. The continuing to do some provocative actions in this area. So that's what we should be take care of.
In short, Senior Colonel Zhou, are we likely to have any hostilities on the periphery of China, given the escalation of tensions in the Korean Peninsula? But the good news is, of course, Mr. Kim Jong-un offered to have a summit meeting with President Donald Trump to aim at denuclearization.
Yes, well, this is certainly a good question, because I myself am rather confused after reading Americans' national security report, which described China as a top competitor. But when I was in the Munich conference, which turned out to be the largest security conference in the world, I actually have heard McMaster talking about how they should prevent the competition among major powers. So this kind of conflicting signals is really interesting, and is also somewhat alarming to me.
The other important concept that China has to look at very seriously is non-traditional threats in the wake of the Cold War. Because particularly after 9/11, President George W. Bush said the overriding concern about the U.S. Homeland Security is that nuclear warheads could possibly fall into the wrong hands of a regime, a rogue state. So do you think China faces the same threats? Well, I'm not talking about ISIL in the Middle East, but I'm addressing the security scenario in general.
Of course, we do have certain common threats. For example, China's national interests now actually have spilled over to overseas. In Gulf of Aden, we are conducting counter-piracy. This is one of the non-traditional threats. Another is to help in peacekeeping. But the major threat to our homeland is actually terrorism. And for that, we do not only need to strengthen our domestic security, but we can also help the neighboring countries to actually push these threats out from China's door. For example, we actually have helped President Duterte in its combat in Marawi against the terrorists. In 2 shipments, we have provided altogether 6,000 rifles, and one of the most advanced sniper rifle actually has killed the so-called emir of the terrorist, which was quite a big news, even from President Duterte. And he said he would like to give this rifle back to China's museum for demonstration.
Let me cross over to Mr. Pavel FELGENHAUER, the Russian defense analyst, for his comments on China's military build-up. Hello, Pavel.
Hello.
Russia and China
Yes.
are 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council, and starting from the years of Boris Yeltsin, the late president of the Russian Federation, we have been able to form or forge a special strategic partnership facing the 21st century. However, it doesn't mean we're going to enter into military alliance. In this case, do you think the very special relationship between Moscow and Beijing will necessarily be a threat to the United States in what is called a geopolitical competition in the new era?
Well, yes, Russia and China have been very closely coordinating their activities in the United Nations Security Council. In some cases, Russia is the lead nation. In other cases, like, say, the Korean problem, China is the lead nation. It's a very fruitful cooperation. China and Russia cooperate in other places, and there's, of course, the basic strategic security common ground, that's to keep the lid over Central Asia, where, say, there's a possible influx from the Middle East of jihadists, and destabilization there would be very detrimental to both Russia and China. Well, actually, it would be detrimental for America and Iran and almost everyone else. So there's a common ground there. But Russia and China are not allies in the sense that there are differences in interests. China is interested, say, in world trade much more than Russia. China needs the Middle Eastern oil coming in, and that's also a very important military now factor, because you have to keep the sea lanes open. Russia has a lesser interest in that, and of course for China it's important that it has better relations with Washington and with Moscow than Moscow and Washington have with each other. China has more or less achieved that goal. But the growing tension between Washington and Moscow is actually dangerous nowadays. It's a threat to, actually, as I said before, to world peace. And for China, as a great economic trading nation, conflict, international conflict, growing international conflict, is not good news. It's not good news internally. It's not good news in general. So China could be a very important moderating influence.
Thank you so much. Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, President Xi Jinping met with the delegates of PLA armed forces in their group deliberations during the plenary session of the National People's Congress. He raised the idea of civilian military integration schemes, or in American English it could be called the military-industrial complex, to help facilitate the transfer of military technologies for the civilian use. That might be a little bit sensitive for overseas observers who follow the dual use of high technology. What do you think of the importance of having more of such integration for our development of the high technology?
Well, I think it's very important in that if you make good integration of these two, you save money and you become more efficient. because in the past, China's military industry actually somewhat separated from civil industry. That means if you want to buy something, if you want to use something, you have to make an investment first by the military itself. But nowadays, China's way of development is more or less like the Western one. That means the defense industry would make research and would produce something and then table it to the military for their choice. Right now it's not completed like this, but this is a way forward. One of the important things is China is considered by the United Nations to be the only country that has all category of industries. That would give China a huge boost in its capability, because such industrial capability can really boost your military in that for your military to be strong, you have to be backed by a strong civilian industry. So President Xi actually has put forward this idea as early as 2015. Actually, before him, his predecessor also mentioned something in this regard. But it is with the passage of time that this become more and more deep-rooted, and this is the way forward.
Having more dynamics in the having more dynamics in the civil-military integration scheme could be viewed as a response to the arms embargo imposed by the European Union and the United States in the wake of the 1981 incident, and therefore China is determined to develop its own military industry. Having said this, if you look at the stories that usually go viral on the internet for fans of the military industry in their millions, they would always look at the development of the hardware as a hallmark to characterize how advanced China's modernization of the armed forces could be. President Xi Jinping makes no secret that by the year 2035, modernization of the armed forces in China should be made possible. Now, what do you think of the scenario?
I think you're absolutely right that modernization not necessarily only mean the hardware development. Is in recent years in the media, a lot of new equipment came to the PLA, and a lot of people is quite happy with that. But to my understanding, modernization have another dimension is even more important than the hardware development. That is people's modernization, their security concept, their mindset, and their skills to to master the new category of weapons, and how to let these military equipment have the desired or expected capabilities in fighting and winning wars. I think there's a long way to go for us.
So what about the improvement of the command and control structure?
Yeah, the structure has been done, and the leadership has been done, and the force structure has been already reformed. Now, this year, the main job of reform is policy of personnel and financial systems. I think that is also very, very important for the education and training and recruitment of talented people into this military. And one of the important policies is that we will have more civilian officials and officers in the series of PLA. And I think that will give some kind of help and let more talented people from civilians to have some contributions in the military modernization drive.
PAVEL, China is an immediate second behind the United States in terms of the military budget, and this year we're going to see an 8% increase. Will that be a wake-up call for not only the West, but Russia could also be very watchful?
Well, Russia, of course, is always watchful on what happens in China. During the Cold War, Russia and China for quite some decades were kind of sworn enemies, and the Russian military considered, well, maybe even till the year 2000, more or less, China to be its main adversary or main potential adversary. Of course, nowadays the mil-to-mil relationship between the Chinese military and the Russian military have drastically improved. But still the Russian military believe, as always any military in the world, that any potential friend can become a potential enemy at some time in the future, and you have to be prepared. And basically, the more enemy you have, the better is your internal position in clamoring for more budgetary funding. So yes, there is a friendly relationship, but it's also a relationship of possible, if not adversaries, at least competitors. Where, as I said, and it's absolutely clear, Russia and China are not allies right now at all. At least not military allies.
Pavel, we are clearly aware that both Russia and the United States possess a formidable nuclear arsenal. Each side could kill the other with a so-called balance of terror over and over. And therefore, after the United States released its nuclear posture policy, many in China are wondering aloud if Russia could still be considered a first-class armed force despite the disintegration of the former Soviet Union.
No, well, there has been changes in American policy, very serious ones. There has been under President Obama a concerted effort to denuclearize the United States military, which has been reversed. And that's, of course, a big difference. And so America is right now rebuilding, remodeling its defense, its nuclear posture. And Russia has been doing that for already quite a number of years. So right now both sides consider themselves and eye each other as kind of the two nuclear powers that balance each other. China has been, luckily, a bit on the side of it, as Russia and America eye each other as possible competitors in the nuclear sphere, which is actually, I most likely believe, is good for China.
Thank you so much, Pavel. I'll go back to you in a few minutes.
Arms race of
Thank you, Pavel. I will go back to you. But the Senior Colonel Zhou Bo, China vows time and again that we will never be the first to use a nuclear preemptive strike, and under whatever circumstances we will not be the first to use a nuclear strike. What do you think of that? What does that mean for our potential strategic rival?
Well, China declared that policy ever since it conducted its first nuclear test in 1964. It's interesting to compare all Chinese defense policies to conclude this policy on nuclear posture actually has remained unchanged ever since then, because ever since the beginning of the 21st century, China actually has changed quite a few of its defense policies, such as no stationing of troops overseas, such as no joining military exercises with foreign countries. China actually have changed all this to adapt to the new realities. But China hasn't changed its nuclear policy. Why is that? Because essentially China believes nuclear weapon is only for deterrence. So what you need to have is to ensure that you have a reliable second strike capability where you are attacked first. So this would make China's response quite flexible, but it will also make China's nuclear arsenal lean but strong.
We've been talking about conventional threat assessment. However, in the wake of the Cold War, increasingly scholars and policymakers have focused their attention on the threat of, for example, terrorism. Since we have millions of soft targets from China, Chinese nationals in their millions are traveling or for business. So how would China deploy its armed forces to protect the Chinese nationals and to protect Chinese assets? Let's take a quick look at how overseas operations of Chinese armed forces would help establish or protect our global stakes. Let's take a quick look. Welcome back. China was able to evade a crisis in Doklam along the border between India and China last year. That captured headlines for a while. However, leaders from both sides were able to hold a summit on the sidelines of the Xiamen BRICS summit. We organized an online debate that involves a correspondent from Hindu, the newspaper that enjoys a large circulation. They still have some doubts as to the intent of China's military build-up. When it comes to whether China is a threat, I'd like to have very quickly your thoughts, Senior Colonel.
Well, China is a threat taken by India. Well, China should not be considered as a threat to India, because even in 50s we called the Indi Chini Bai Bai. That means China and India are brothers. And we talk about how 1 + 1 becomes 11, because China and India altogether could actually create something exceptional. But this, of course, is a kind of a description. Why should India take China as a threat? In Doklam, that is clearly Chinese territory, and India admits that it's not Indian territory. So we had a standoff, but we're happy we have resolved this.
Professor Xu.
I think China is a country, especially among the P5s, is the only one that has not been fully resolved its territory issue, and its sovereignty also in danger. So given that, we need to develop conventional forces which should have a strong deterrence against any invasion, any separatism, and different type of aggressions. On the other hand, we also need to develop our capability to fight and win the wars in case of the fail of deterrence. But these are not the only means for us to maintain security. So we have spent a lot of efforts to communicate with our neighboring countries, especially those who have some disputes with us. And also we try to have a comprehensive approach to strengthen our common interest, make the common cake bigger, and strengthening communication, and to have more mutual understandings. And given that, I think China have today's defense policy we call the active defense. It composed of 3 parts. Number 1, strengthening our deterrence capability. Number 2, development and the modernization of the PLA. Number 3, strengthening cooperation with other countries. And in the recent years, especially with the development of modernization, Chinese government didn't use of the force to fight and take our territories back. We continue to talk and try to have a peaceful solution. At the same time, we absolutely carry out more and more international responsibilities in maintaining peace and security, especially in terms of non-traditional security areas, as mentioned by my colleague, Senior Colonel Zhou. I think that was the fact.
When we assess China's national security, the male-to-male relationship between the United States and China would always capture our attention. Taking the South China Sea as an example, since we have had very serious disputes about the interpretation on the Nan-Dash line, and particularly the alleged island enlargement in the territorial waters. The Pacific Fleet of the United States keeps patrolling the water jointly with the Australians and even Indians while offers to help. The Japanese are no exception. So what do you think of the current quiet waters? On the other hand, the quiet waters may run deep. But what do you think of the relatively quiet situation in the South China Sea?
Well, there certainly is a big difference between Obama administration and Trump administration. During Obama administration, altogether, they conducted 4 so-called freedom of navigation operations. But ever since Trump took office, so far he has conducted 6. So we have taken notice that this kind of operation has somehow become regularized. But the interesting point is, the United States maintains that it has no position on the issue of South China Sea, and it won't take sides. The other fact is, China and the ASEAN countries' relationship has certainly improved a lot, starting with negotiation of code of conduct. So against this background, what is the legitimacy of Americans' continuous sailing into the 12 nautical miles of China-controlled islands if indeed it has no position on this issue. Actually, by continuous sailing, the United States has made this issue an outstanding issue between Chinese and American military, which shouldn't be an issue at all.
Pretty soon, lawmakers in the United States, PAVEL, lawmakers in the United States are likely to approve the Taiwan Travel Act. That's said to be the second landmark document following the Taiwan Relations Act to interfere with the internal affairs of China, and of course tensions are likely to rise in the Pacific Ocean. Moscow keeps selling conventional arms to Vietnam, starting from the Cold War. Now, what do you think of the military presence of China in this area? Do you foresee any conflicts between the biggest and the second biggest military?
Well, there is, of course, a potential. There was the Hainan incident some years ago, which was a very nasty incident. Well, it was resolved, but it demonstrated what could actually go wrong in the South China Sea and how dangerous potentially that situation there is. And there, of course, are local players like Vietnam, which is actually right now trying to improve its relations with the United States. And there's Russia, who has a traditional stake in Vietnam and actually does not really want to get involved between, say, China and Vietnam over the South China Sea. It's a very complicated issue, but there are I think all sides will be able to figure it out. There's an underlying interest in keeping the trade going. That's very important for China. China is a world trading power now, and that means its interests extend far away from the South China Sea into Africa, into the Middle East, Indian Ocean.
Thank you
China
so much,
is
PAVEL.
bigger right now than just its border issues.
We'll bring you back next time and continue to discuss the mil-to-mil relationship between the United States and Moscow, and particularly the alleged China threat in the Indo-Pacific region. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.